Have I made verbs irrelevant and meaningless? Technically, yes. But no. Let me explain. I have gotten the challenge for this video after I have seen Agma Schwa's video on verblessness, and why that doesn't exist in the world of conlanging as we know it. But I think I can implement something like verblessness in my language that I am in the progress of making. And to anyone who is watching this video, this may give you some ideas on how to do verblessness in your language. If you have not already, please check out his video if you are inclined to learn more about why verblessness is non-existent. The link will be in the description. In my language, which I have dubbed the language of sorrow, I have a bunch of anatomical organisms that function similarly to mechanical boxes. Some of the boxes are not really boxes, but are more like parts. I have images of them which I will show on the screen. Side note, I apologize to anyone who doesn't like AI art, because these are generated by AI. I have them as placeholders for now. I will do art of them later. Digressing from that, let's start breaking verbs. A verb is required to have predicate heads that combine with subjects, allows inflectional morphology, and differentiates these words from nouns, adjectives, particles, etc. So let's break this one step at a time. First of all in the sentence, I need food. First of all in the sentence, I need food, where I is a subject and need food as a predicate. Taking away need would just make what was a sentence into a series of complex utterances, which would be completely independent from each other. I would be independent from food and vice versa. To break this part of the definition, I would have to make need into a predicate. Let's make need into a predicate. To make this into a predicate, I would have to use set logic to do so. Oh my god. Here is the set logic. I'll show this on screen. Here, this means that there exists a word need that implies a null subject called something. Something is independent from need, and need is dependent on something. Need cannot exist without something. Now the word need cannot exist without the word something. If we take this more generally and apply this to all verbs, which I will denote as X, which I will now show on screen, there exists a word X that implies a null subject called something. Something is independent from X, and X is dependent on something. X cannot exist without something. I can take this one step further. If I say that something is a much weaker noun that can easily be dropped like a pronoun called W, then X or need may be its own clause and may be a whole new sentence without an argument. I'll show this one on screen. There exists a word X that implies a null subject called W. W is independent from X, and X is dependent on W. X cannot exist without W. On to the next step, which allows inflectional morphology. This is actually quite easy to break. I just need to not allow the word that we have defined to take marking. We can show this in set logic as, which I will now show on screen. There exists a word X that implies a null subject called something. Something is independent from X, and X is dependent on something. X cannot exist without something. X must be isolated. Or, what I will now show on screen, there exists a word X that implies a null subject called W. W is independent from X, and X is dependent on W. X cannot exist without W. X must be isolated. Now I can finally about this step. This is also easy. I just need to expand X to include all words, not just verbs. I denote this as the following, where Y is all other words. I'll show this expression on screen. There exists a word X that implies a null subject called W. W is independent from X, and X is dependent on W. X cannot exist without W, X must be isolated, and Y is any word that is a part of the set of X. Well, that is it, right? Right? Not by a long shot. Actually, this is the final stretch, so I don't know what I'm saying. This is because even though I have broken the definition of verbs, I haven't broken their functionality. Verbs denote relations and events and behaves like a function. I haven't broken that part yet, so as a lightning round, I will show you the following expressions. Here's the first expression. There exists a word X that implies a null subject called W. W is independent from X, and X is dependent on W. X cannot exist without W. W must be isolated. Y is any word that is a part of the set of X. A word X implies X and only X. And here's the second expression. There exists a word X that implies a null subject called W. W is independent from X, and X is dependent on W. X cannot exist without W. X must be isolated. Y is any word that is a part of the set of X. A word X implies X and only X, and a word X is a function of itself and only itself. In conclusion, this is how I break verbs entirely using set theory. I'm thinking about implementing this in my language to a certain extent. If you got any ideas out of this, I am happy to be of service to your cursed ideas. I have big plans for this channel, which are not so cursed. Until then, keep doing what you do best.